Everyone, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to speak with all of you. I'm going to run through a bit of a presentation here, and then hopefully we'll leave more than enough time for questions, and I would love to answer them as they come up. A couple of housekeeping notes. So it is 5 p.m. Here on the West Coast, and I am a father of two human kids and two canine kids. So sometimes it gets a little noisy here, here at my house. And so if you hear any screaming, laughing, or barking, you know what that is. Please pay it no mind. So guys, I'm really excited to talk to you today about immigration. It's been a really tumultuous several years, as you know, and as we've experienced. And wanted to talk about what, kind of lays on the horizon for us. I'll also talk about, for anybody who's interested, who's on a visa right now and might be interested in starting a company of their own, or just generally kind of working kind of within the startup context, what that's like and what you should be taking into consideration. And then also just generally, if you're on a visa or even on a green card for that matter, how to run an immigration diagnostic check, just like you would do in your car every once in a while. You got to do it on yourself too, just to make sure everything's working fine. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started here. Let me advance a slide. Before we can really talk about the next 4 years, we have to look at kind of what happened in the last 4 years, and it was insane. Looking back, I didn't realize it was that many, but there were more than 400 immigration policy changes implemented in the last 4 years. And these were not just all on H-1Bs or green cards, they were on immigrant visas, family-based immigration, asylum, just across the board, all with pretty much a consistent focus and intention to make immigration hard, with the ultimate motivation to discourage people from coming here. So that's not speculation. That's pretty much a stated intention of the government. Generally speaking, you have the president and then you have Congress, right? There's two different branches. Congress will make the rules. They get to write the rules. And the president and the executive branch has to enforce them. So they couldn't make new rules per se because Congress has to do that, right? But within immigration, the executive branch has really wide latitude as to how they enforce rules. And they do that through making policy changes. So that happened, as we all know, and it was insane. There was kind of a 3 times more work visa denials in the last 4 years. Almost 300,000 fewer work visas were approved for a variety of reasons. They just got harder on work visas. Less people applied, like just a bunch of different reasons that were all kind of like direct or indirect results of these policy changes. What we did see were a dramatic increase in lawsuits against the government in reaction to pretty much these arbitrary changes, right? Mostly on a case-by-case basis. So you're not going to hear about a lot of them in the press. Some of them were like the Muslim ban, and others were pretty famous and got a lot of press coverage. But the vast majority of lawsuits were individuals. Our firm has a bunch of them too. And they were for like slowdowns on cases. Like if you were married to an H-1B visa holder and you're applying for work permit, it's taking forever right now. And so we're suing the government because of what we perceive to be an intentional slowdown on those kinds of things, or denials that just didn't make any sense, right? We would sue the government in federal court to challenge them, and most of the time we would win, right? So that would tell you that it was grim times. But we and you and all together, we just kind of did whatever we could to get through it, and really not back down to the extent possible. In terms of kind of what we're still dealing with right now, there is the visa stamping ban. So there were two kinds of bans. One of them, we actually got news today. One of them was ended, which is the immigrant visa ban, right? That was the ban implemented last year, right around when COVID kind of took off here in the US. And that was the ban for green cards or immigrant visas. But the immigrant visa is the word we use for green cards when they're issued abroad, like at consulates abroad. Okay, so if your family sponsored you, or if your work sponsored you, or you got the green card lottery, but you had to get your green card at a consulate because you weren't here. They banned those for a year. That was just rescinded today. So that's great news. And that was because of lawsuits that were threatening them. We were winning in court on those bans, and so they decided to pull those back. What still remains is what they call the non-immigrant visa ban. Non-immigrant visas are temporary visas, right? H-1B visas, student visas, trainee visas, intercompany transfer visas. A visa stamping ban is different than getting cases approved here, okay? You can still get cases approved here in the US, but if you want to travel and come back in, you need a visa stamp. And that ban still remains in effect until the end of March. There are exceptions to that ban on a case-by-case basis, mostly in the national interest. But that plus COVID, where the concepts are not even working at full capacity right now, it's really tough to get visa stamping or visa stamps approved right now. So that's still happening. But you might have heard of like three law changes or rule changes that Trump tried to implement in January before he left. We don't have to worry about those anymore. One of them was, you heard about the required increase in H-1B salaries. That has been overturned, and there's no requirement for that anymore. Anybody who's working for a staffing company or consulting company, their end clients were going to have to file H-1Bs for you in addition to your employer, which was crazy. I have no idea how that was going to work, but that's not going to happen anymore. And I think most timely, they were going to change the H-1B lottery, right? They were going to say, we were going to start giving H-1Bs to the jobs that paid the most, right? So great, like Google and Apple and all those companies that get H-1Bs, but what about startups? What about universities or smaller companies? They were not going to get them. However, we don't have to worry about that anymore. So that's great. So pretty much as soon as Biden became president, he and his administration rescinded those rules. The other things that he did, like I mentioned, he reversed the travel ban for Muslim majority countries. He issued some proclamations to protect dreamers or DACA recipients, if you know what those are. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in legislation. He ended the national emergency on the border, the quote unquote national emergency, which was technically funding the construction of the border wall. And he said that he would allow the inclusion of undocumented immigrants in the 2020 census count, which was not the position of the prior administration. Now, the big kind of unknown now, what's going to happen over the next several months, if not years, okay? On day one, he introduced an immigration bill, a very comprehensive, gigantic immigration bill to Congress. Like I said, Congress is the one that can make long-standing changes to immigration rules here, like things like more H-1Bs instead of like the current quota, or more green cards, right? Or doing away with like the country-based quota for green cards. Those are the kind of things that Congress has to do. And so for the first time in maybe about 10 years or more, it's almost like 15 years now, we've seen a comprehensive bill introduced, which is great news. However, the not so great news is that it's probably not going to pass in this current form. And that's because we need 60 votes in the Senate to do that. When I say we, I mean those of us that like the bill. We're not going to get 60 votes. We have 51 Democrat votes, 49 Republican votes, and I think almost every Republican will vote against this bill. So I think that was known by the Biden administration. It's a starting point, is what this is basically. And what they're going to end up doing probably is then pull back and start breaking this bill up into various pieces and trying to get them approved based on what the Republicans are more inclined to say yes to, okay? So in terms of the components to this bill, the biggest one, the one that makes the most news, is a path for citizenship for those who are in the country without any documentation, right? Maybe 10 to 15 to 20 million people. We don't have like an accurate count. It's a lot of people. And they would have to have been in the country before January 1st, 2021. So any news you hear of people saying, trying to get here right now to get into the country for this rule, they wouldn't even be qualified in the first place. You had to have already been here. This is the most unpopular portion of the rule, as you can imagine. And it's probably the part that's not going to get approved, at least initially, but we'll see what happens. I think the thing that's most relevant to this group is the potential to clear the backlog, right, for employment and family-based green cards. So there was already 2 bills, as you probably know, and one in the House, one in the Senate, to do just that. Right now, and by the way, let me just say, like, the last time Congress changed our immigration rules, they introduced the bill in 2005 or 2006. But the last time they were changed were in the mid 90s. Like, can you imagine? Like, our world's completely different, yet we're still, kind of being toyed with these kind of really, really old rules. And so it is high time they change. And that's what, back then is when they did the per country limitation. So back then they said, we don't want, one country to monopolize, right, the immigration kind of process and the flow into this country. We want to have equal diversity amongst all countries. Maybe that made some sense back then. I'm not even sure if it did back then. It certainly doesn't right now, right? So, and more specifically, it's because a lot of our talent, a lot of our applicants and a lot of the individuals that companies want here in the US are from India and from China, right? So because only a certain amount can come in every year, their lines are way longer than the lines for people from other countries. And that's pretty much that's really unfair. And we're hoping that'll change. That is an essential aspect of this bill. They would also clear the backlog by recapturing unused numbers that were, numbers that were not used in the past, and stop counting derivatives or family members towards the quota. So hopefully that'll be great to clear up the backlog. And I think that chances are pretty good that we're going to see something along the lines of this year or next year. So crossing our fingers. There's the 3 and 10-year bars, which are basically, they were created back in the 90s, like I mentioned before. And if you had come into the country and stayed illegally here, or came legally but stayed, overstayed your visa, once you leave, you can't come back in for 3 or 10 years. This bill would eliminate that bar. So I think that'd be a kind of a humane thing to do. And it would make getting green cards easier, especially if you have a PhD. You would pretty much be handed a green card, right? But it would take steps to make, especially for advanced degree holders, the process for getting a green card easier. So I do think, kind of from this list, I do see some movement to make the green card easier, clear backlogs. Those kinds of things are pretty much, not want to say universally, but certainly on a bipartisan basis, are things that Congress wants to do, because they do recognize, more so now than ever before, the impact and positive effects for national talent in this country, on our economy and companies, and in innovation in general. So the other part that we have here are the H-4 EADs. So EADs are employment authorization documents, if you don't know that. H-4s are spouses of H-1B visa holders. This work authorization, only 100,000 people in the country have this, yet it was a target, constant target by the Trump administration. They kept trying to take it away. They didn't succeed, but there were multiple lawsuits about this. The Biden administration has pretty much said they're not going to contest it. And in fact, they would like to actually make it formally legal as part of this bill. So that's great news. Age outs are, something most of you don't have to worry about for your kids. But people my age, for example, if I came, 10, 12 years ago with an H-1B and had a child, my child who was in H-4 status might age out if I didn't get my green card, meaning they'd have to find their own immigrant, like a visa status, which is, a complete nightmare. I couldn't imagine how stressful that is. So this bill would also do away with that. So you can see the other kind of, aspects of the bill that would help immigration, I think, for the most part. They would stop calling people aliens, which I think is awesome and long overdue. So that's kind of what we have on the horizon. I think we're going to see change slowly. It's going to be contentious. It's going to be frustrating. But what we do have now is an administration that has already put somebody in power. Ali Mayorkas, who's the head of DHS now, is about as pro-immigrant as you'll ever see in that position. Okay, and he used to be the head of USCIS under Obama, and we're already seeing kind of a more customer service focused USCIS now. We're seeing a little bit more of a reasonable agency. Okay, it's going to take some time, but so far the returns are favorable, and we're cautiously optimistic about immigration becoming just kind of better and this less stressful and more reasonable and more well-intentioned. But we'll see how it goes, and we're not holding our breath till we get there. Okay, so I'm going to quickly move on to like the next area, which is for anybody who's interested here, if you're on a visa and you want to start a company, right? What are some of the considerations? Like, is it possible? And my first answer is it's absolutely possible. We've done it hundreds of times now, but you have to plan for it and do it in the right way, right? And so, and doing it in the right way really depends on what your visa status is, right? So if you're an F1 or a student visa holder F1, or on the OPT, which is your, the optional practical training work permit, or its cousin, the STEM OPT, which is the longer version of that. They all kind of are work under the same rules of the student visa rules, right? If you don't have your OPT or STEM OPT yet, but you want to start a company, there are some things that you can do. In furtherance of that, you can start forming the company. You can go out and talk to investors and maybe get funding. Those kinds of things all kind of arguably fall under the, you can hold meetings. There's once you start building your product and once you start hiring employees and those kinds of things, that's when you need a work permit. I will say that it's kind of a gray area, right? It's not just like a black or white thing. There's a continuum of these activities that occur, and they often don't occur in a linear fashion, right? So certainly talk to an immigration lawyer to help guide you through this. But once you get to LPT and STEM LPT, you can start a company, on that. You can certainly work towards it, and you have to make sure that you're working in lockstep with your school, right? Because they have certain reporting requirements to CVIS and to ICE about your activities and what you're doing. So certainly make sure you talk to them or your DSO to make sure you're doing it correctly. Okay. I know that the next step after the F1 is the H1B visa, right? And obviously the lottery is coming up on March 9th, and it's going to run for a couple weeks. So anybody here who's going to be entering into that, I wish you all the best of luck. We'll find out by the end of March if you're picked. And then if you're picked, your company has 2 months to file the H-1B petition. If it's approved, then it becomes effective on October 1st. And then basically you have 6 years of H-1B status. And then the idea is you try to get the green card done within that time. And then that's kind of like the process that everybody goes through once they start working on the H-1B. So it's a little different if you're going to be a founder on an H-1B than if you're just going to be an employee of like a standard company. And the reason for that is because part of the rule for an H-1B is that you be an employee. So if you're, and what I mean by employee is like somebody can direct like what you do, right, on a day-to-day basis, or just direct you in some way, shape, or form, right? Typically, if you're a founder, obviously it's not the case. However, USCIS will be, pretty like reasonable about this, and they'll look at it differently. They'll just say, okay, well, if let's say there's 3 founders, okay, and you're one of them. Well, the other 2 founders can outvote you, theoretically, right? Assuming that the ownership kind of breaks down that way. If you can be outvoted by your other founders or by your board or something like that, then you are an employee, in air quotes, right? You're an employee to the company's employer for H-1B purposes. So that's like the first hurdle you have to cross. The second one is I mean, if you're a founder, you're obviously not wanting to pay yourself salary or as much as possible, right? You're trying to save money and spend that on kind of more meaningful and important, items for your company. But you do have to have a salary for the H-1B, and it has to meet kind of this prevailing wage, this minimum wage threshold. It depends on what the job is and where you're going to be located and all sorts of different factors. But just make sure that you keep that in mind, okay? And then the final stage is kind of at what point is the company, mature enough to be able to support an H-1B? We've done really early stage, and I know other law firms have done so too. Really early stage startups with less than $1 million in funding, maybe just a couple of employees. I think you just have to have some way to convince the government that you have something. Maybe you have a contract with a customer already. Maybe you got some funding. You have a beautiful pitch deck. You've obviously set up and you've formed the company. But there is a point where, before that, it may not be the best idea. And then right after that, I think we can do it. And it's kind of a subjective thing. We'll know when we see it. But it's probably earlier than you think. And it's certainly been done several times. So hopefully that gives you some level of optimism about using the H-1B to start your own company. The O-1 visa, something you should at least take a look at. It's for extraordinary ability individuals, people that are at the top of their field. I know it's hard to do that coming just out of school, but you can always look at it down the line. I have done it. We have done it for people just out of school because they have done some amazing things during school, maybe between their undergrad and their masters, right? Maybe they have a lot of research publications, those kinds of things, won a ton of awards, maybe even have a patent or two. Like if you have things like that, then you should look at the O-1 visa. Like don't just automatically eliminate that possibility. There's no problem to be like the owner of a company and to have the O-1. You don't have the same kind of employer-employee issues as you do with the H-1B. So it's a much more flexible visa if you happen to qualify, okay? Also look at the E2 and L1. The E2 visa is like it's called a treaty investor visa. It's based on treaties between the US and a bunch of different countries. So if you're from one of those countries, you can possibly do it. You have to invest a certain amount of money into the US, meaning into your company here in the US. Usually that's around $80,000 to $100,000. The money has to come from your country. And if you're able to do that, you can possibly get the E2 visa. Unfortunately, countries like India and China don't have treaties with the US because they know that they probably lose so many of their great entrepreneurs to the US, so they haven't signed off on that treaty. But if you're not from one of those countries, you can take a look at this as a possible option, especially if your investment's coming from that source. Okay. And the L1 visa is if you had a company abroad and you want to open up a subsidiary or a parent or just an affiliate of the company here, you can look at the L1 intra-company transfer visa that functions a lot like the E2, but it's not subject to the limitations of the treaties. So but what you do have to do is you have to make sure that you have the company abroad that you've been working with for at least a year in the past 3 years. Okay. I got one more slide, then I'll turn it over to Tiffany. And hopefully I haven't talked too fast for all of you, but it's one thing that I'd like to do is to make sure that you're all taking care of yourselves from a kind of an immigration health standpoint, and also know how to do so in the future, right? Because these are things that no one really tells you about, but are really, really important, okay? Number one is that it's always been the rule that you notify USCIS when you change your address, okay? There's a form called AR11. It's online. Just Google it on the USCIS website, and you can file it online too. Now, technically, if you don't do it, you are deportable. Like that's what the law says. Okay, have they ever deported anybody? No, but I mean, why ever take that chance? Make sure you do that every time you change your address. Okay, this goes for even when you get your green card, because if you're a green card, you're still considered an immigrant until you get your citizenship here. So make sure it's you get into the habit of following that AR11. Okay. For those of you especially who are on H-1B or other visas or will be soon, always check your what's called the I-94 form every time you come back in from international travel. Okay, so when you come in from international travel, you have your visa, right? And you show the officer at the airport your visa. That officer may have just gone through thousands of people and may have just, maybe sleepy, maybe tired, may just kind of be bored, and may make a mistake on your I-94. Your I-94 is a form that governs your status here. They enter some, dates on the computer, and then you go home and you can kind of go online and check out what they did, right? If they shortchange your status, meaning they shortchange your expiration, that holds, okay? And then if you don't know it, and you pass that date without filing an extension, you're out of status, and that'd be a major disaster, okay? They can also do that if your passport is expiring early or soon. Let's say you have 2 years left on your H-1B, but your passport expires in 4 months. They might make your expiration 4 months, okay? So you can get these things fixed by going to what's called deferred inspection. Talk to an attorney to shoot me an email if this has ever happened to you. I'd be happy to help. Don't worry about it, but just make sure you check your I-94 because you will be responsible for any mistakes or short changes they make, okay? So really, really important. If you've ever had any encounters with police officers, even if an arrest didn't occur, something more than a typical citation, but even in that case, like in some states, a citation is a misdemeanor, right? So if you've had anything like a misdemeanor or above, please do talk to somebody, talk to an attorney, because that can really impact your immigration status. If you're working with a company and the company has a law firm, talk to them. Like they're not going to tell your company, okay? Nor does the company really even want to know. But everyone just wants to make sure that you're taken care of. And so make sure you talk to the law firm or talk to a lawyer to make sure that there's nothing that you have to be, worried about or nothing's changed because of what happened, okay? Similarly, when, especially if you're on H-1B status, when your job changes, let's say you get promoted or you move to a different job, make sure you tell your law firm because they may have to amend your status. And when you travel, please do make sure you have all the documentation that you need to re-enter correctly. In almost all cases, that means a visa stamp that's valid, right? If you're on a student visa right now, it means obviously your F1 student visa stamp. It means your I-20 form that's annotated for travel, right, from your designated student officer. It could mean your OPT work permit if you have that, and even your pay stubs from your employer, right, to show that you've been working, if in fact you have that. These documents will be kind of different for each person, but just make sure that you talk to somebody. If you're in school, talk to your DSO about what you should have with you when you travel, because you don't want to be caught empty-handed, when you come back from a very long trip. So these are just some things. Look, they may not be a big deal right now for you if you're kind of like in your earliest stage of your immigration status, but these are things you always want to take into account for the future. So please do remember to run an occasional diagnostic check on yourself because it just might be worth it at some point. So Tiffany, that's all that I have, and so I'm happy to take some questions now.
Thank you, Samir. So folks love your talk. There are a lot of questions lined up, but what I'll do is I will paste the Slido link in the chat again, and people can look through them and upvote the questions that they like. And then maybe like 1 or 2 minutes later, we can come back and we can do the Q&A. And now it's a good time if you have any question to like type it on Slido as well.
Um, Hi, I had a question. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a question about like, does it have an impact if you leave the country like more than once or twice in a year and then come back? Does it impact your immigration status, or like, am I less likely to get a green card if I do that?
I mean, generally you should be able to travel as much as you want. I mean, your ability to travel is governed by a lot of things that are specific to you. So I can't answer your question, unfortunately, in a way that's probably helpful to you right now. But I'm happy to talk to you offline if you'd like. If you send me maybe an email, and I didn't put my email up on here, but it's I'll text it, I'll chat it into here, and you can, if you have any questions about that, you can just send me an email.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Cool. I'll let Samir finish typing his email first. Okay, cool. We can go over the Q&A question. So a lot of the attendees here are aspiring founders. So a lot of the questions are going to be about like just founding a company as an immigrant. And so the first question we have for you is, so this person who asked the question is currently working with his or her employer on OPT, but planning to apply for a green card through working on his or her startup. What is the best path for this while on OPT?
So once again, this is probably a longer conversation because the plans can be so specific to your particular situation, right? But generally speaking, if you want to end up with the green card through your startup, if that's the question that if I heard it correctly, as a founder, it can be honestly a little difficult in the beginning because 90% of people who apply for green cards through work have to go through a labor market test. And if you have any ownership interest in your company, you can't do the labor market test because it's not an authentic one, right? You own the company. So typically what most founders do is that they build up their body of work, and over time, they become so well known in their field through maybe successful exits, acquisitions, those kinds of things, or they just get enough press, right? Where they apply for what's called the Extraordinary Ability Green Card, the EB-1A, where you don't need a labor market test. You can just sponsor yourself for that. Or a national interest waiver, which is the argument that what you're doing through your company is in the interest of the country, right? It's so profoundly connected to the welfare of our country that's in the national interest for them to waive the labor market test. So those are the two ways that I would suggest you start thinking about, because a lot of people come to me and want to do that. If they had planned beforehand a couple of years ago, before that maybe, to set themselves up, they might be in a position to do it at that point, right? So there are things that you can do. You can work on it over the next year or two or three to put yourself in a position to be successful at those applications. And that's what I'd suggest.
Can you elaborate a little more on the labor market test?
So yeah, I mean, so imagine, and one more thing, sorry, Tiffany, if you're OPT, eventually you want to go try to get the H-1B first, right? Because obviously the OPT is going to come to an end at some point. But the F1 visa right now, maybe that'll change with this legislation. But right now, the student visa, the OPT, is not consistent with the green card. Like, you're not supposed to have the intent to get a green card while you're on it. There are some ways to do it, but it's not the safest thing in the world, right? So that's another reason why you want the H-1B, which is dual intent, meaning you can have the intent to get a green card, but also have the intent to go home if you'd like to at some point in time. So it's more flexible that way. And then Tiffany, the labor market test, that's right. So like I said, let's say you're an employee for, I don't know, Google, okay? So you're hired as an engineer, an OPT, they apply for your H-1B, you get it. The minute you get your H-1B, they'll start the labor market test process for you, okay? It's called a perm process. And they will essentially by law, they have to go through this process if you want to get a green card through them. They will start recruiting for the role that you already hold. Okay, they'll put ads out. Then they'll get resumes from US workers. Most of the time it shows that they're not able to find anybody who's qualified to do the job like you are, right? But sometimes very minor occasions, they might get enough resumes, but generally, especially within tech, they don't. And then they move on to kind of the next steps of the green card process. But that whole process can take at least a year. And the following step, the second step could take another year. And then if you're from India or China right now, you're waiting for several more years before your place in line becomes, current for the green card.
Got it. Thanks for the explanation. The next question is, can you incorporate your company in a foreign country while you work on H-1B for another company?
You can incorporate your company in a foreign country while you're here on H-1B working for another company. Incorporating a company is one thing. Doing work for that company, at least in the eyes of the immigration authorities, is another, right? So you technically can't do that. However, I would say like somebody who's on an H-1B here for company A, if they incorporated a company in another country and just started building a product without, paying themselves or doing, not really being in the public eye about it, I really don't know if that's even going to cross anybody's radar. But you have to be careful. Definitely talk to an immigration lawyer about that.
Got it. Can an E2 visa holder apply for a green card?
Great question. I was going to mention that and I didn't. Yes, they can. An E2 visa is not a dual intent visa. However, like I said before, there are ways to apply for the green card. If you own the company, then the only way to do it would probably be through the extraordinary ability, like I mentioned before, right? Or you can just go through the labor market test, like I also mentioned before, which is the other option for people. But you certainly are able, you're legally able to pursue the green card while on the E2.
Got it. So what options does an immigrant have if their startup fails, considering they did not have green card by the time the startup went out of business?
So, yeah, obviously, like, I'm assuming in that case, like you're on the work visa, like the startup has sponsored the work visa for you, and the startup has failed. If that's the scenario that's being posed, like the bummer about immigration here is that your work visa is tied to your job, right? So if your job goes away, so does your work visa. And at that point, you have, generally speaking, 2 months to find another job, or to leave the country, or to change your status to a different immigration status. So these are all kind of bumps in the road on the way to getting a green card. But it doesn't preclude you from getting the green card ultimately. But I think at that point, if your startup fails, the most important thing you can do is find a job, because you need that job to support your visa and stay here.
Yeah, that would be in line with how work visa usually work in this country.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, does an immigrant founder's company need to raise a minimum amount of funding or capital before being able to actually work at the company?
No. And I don't know if that person means to found the company. Was that a founder, or was that just a working at the company as an employee?
I would imagine start working on the company.
Yeah.
For full time.
I would say there has to be, like I said, there isn't a minimum amount to show the government. What the government needs to feel is that the company will make enough money to pay your salary and the salary of any of its other employees for the 3-year period covered by the H-1B, right? So what we've generally seen is somewhere in the range of 400 or 500,000, kind of as a minimum amount to support that. It can also mean just revenue. Like, what if you have contracts? So what if you have customers already, and you're already licensing your product or whatever you're doing, you're making some revenue. That can also help. But there has to be, you have to give the government kind of an overall feeling that that the company would be able to support your salary. Like that's their main concern.
Got it. Okay, the next question is, given the clearance of backlogs of existing green card application, what is the expected wait time for a green card for current applicants?
It's pretty long. If you're from India, it's like at least 8 to 10 years, if not longer. I'm being very generous right now. If you're from China, it's a little less. If you're not from one of those countries, it's generally 2 to 3 years, like somewhere in that range. But it's pretty bad, honestly, especially for Indian nationals.
I see. As an immigrant founder, should you consider startup accelerators or incubators for your startup? Is there like any benefits?
Sure. And one last answer to the last question. I'm so sorry. The quota is based on like your place in line in your preference category. The extraordinary ability that I talked about, the wait times are much shorter for that. So for Indian nationals, it's like 6 months or a year right now. So that's it. That's the other like massive benefit to being able to qualify in that category. Yeah, there are. I mean, in fact, somebody texted me one or just chatted one to me right now, but there are several programs, especially some ones that are sponsored by universities. And so there are two kinds of H-1Bs. There are H-1Bs that are subject to the lottery cap subject H-1Bs, and there's cap exempt H-1Bs, okay? Once you get an H-1B, then the rest of your H-1Bs are cap exempt, but the first one's always cap subject. You have to get in the lottery first, right? But there's some H-1Bs that are cap exempt even if they're your first one. For example, if you work for a university or you work for a nonprofit research organization, they can apply for H-1Bs year round. So what some universities have done is that they've created incubator programs, or they've created kind of just like internship or externship programs or just fellowships or things like that, where they will sponsor your H-1B under the university, and you do like 5 or 10 hours of work with them. And then you can get another H-1B because you have this one to work on your own company. And so there are actually quite a few of these now popping up around the country in partnerships with various university systems. The one that was texted to me here or chatted to me was a program initiated at UMass in Boston. It's called the Entrepreneur. Just give me one second. It's the Entrepreneur Visa Sponsorship Program, I think. But it's an incubator there. So like they'll do that for you. I know Y Combinator is affiliated with one of them. I know there's a system in New York. There's quite a few actually now. And this is like a totally legitimate way to get an H-1B and work on your company if you didn't get an H-1B in the lottery.
I see. Can you describe more about the characteristics of founders that applied and received a green card through the NIW process?
Oh, sure. So they're often working in fields, like I said, that are kind of an intrinsic benefit to the country. Let's say you're working in a new way to combat COVID, right? Like that would be one. Maybe you're working in clean energy, right? Like you're doing something like that. But not only are you doing something like that, you are kind of groundbreaking in that field, okay? You're researching heavily. Like you're somebody who is really pushing or moving the needle or making a real impact in that area. So if you have those kinds of two aspects working for you, then you might consider the national interest waiver. Literally, there's no limit to what's considered in the national interest. You just have to imagine, like, we'd have to make a good argument, right? That what you're doing is truly of our country's interest, right? And so but you get the idea. It's something that would just make the country a better place.
Is there any sort of indicator as to whether your research is actually moving the country to a better place, besides, maybe generating revenue or getting grants?
Generally, it's revenue, it's getting grants,
Mhm.
it's kind of an objective press coverage, right? It's kind of like third-party recognition of what you're doing, right? It's things like that, and so there's no one right answer for that, but it's if you're able to show, like if you've gotten awards, in your field, things like that, then those are examples of ways that people have shown that they're really moving the needle in this field.
I see. Okay, the next question is, as someone whose OPT is coming to an end, what are the options they can look at to continue working in the USA?
So I'm assuming that you're talking about STEM LPT, or if you haven't and you're eligible, you can apply for STEM LPT too, which is two more years of work authorization. If you're working for a company that has the E-Verify and you're in a STEM major. So that's one way to do it. Trying to get in under the H-1B lottery, have a company sponsor you for an H-1B would extend your OPT from its expiration to October 1st and bridge that gap of employment. You can look at the O visa if you believe that, let's say you're a PhD, or if you believe that possibly you might qualify for the extraordinary ability. Once again, look at these H-1B cap exempt, or the cap exempt H-1Bs, working with nonprofit research organizations or working with companies that work with them or universities. And if you know somebody kind of in that area that's willing to help you, they could potentially sponsor you for an H-1B that is not subject to the annual lottery. Those are some ideas, and there's probably more depending on your personal background. If you're from Canada, you can do a TN visa, or Mexico, a TN visa. If you're from Chile or Singapore, you can do an H-1B1 visa. If you're from Australia, you can do an E3 visa. And happy to talk, offline about any kind of more specific options out there.
I see. There are really many different types of visa.
Yeah, not enough, but there are some. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next question is, do you have any good resources as to keep track of the new policies or immigration change on a regular basis?
I would say if you're on Twitter, there's some good Twitter accounts that are updating the changes as they come in. You can email me offline, and I can send those to you. Usually immigration lawyers that are heavily involved on Twitter and just kind of pushing information out there. Some of my colleagues. I'm not so much on Twitter. I'm actually not on Twitter at all anymore. It was not good for me. But certainly that's probably the best place right now, because I don't think the media does a great job of it. Not because they're not trying. It's really complicated, and you kind of have to understand the subject matter to give justice to kind of the significance of the developments. And so you don't really get a clear picture from them. So yeah, there are some lawyers that do a good job on Twitter, and I'd recommend following them. Yeah.
Sounds good. I'm pretty sure that's something we're all interested in. So maybe I would just follow up with you after the event so you can give me a list of like good Twitter accounts to follow,
Sure.
and I'll send it out to everybody. Okay, the next question is, can you describe more about the characteristics of people who applied successfully for the O1 visa? I know you touch upon it a little bit, but I guess folks are more interested, like one and more in-depth example.
Yeah. So for those that are kind of like, closer to like their date of graduation, right? Like did not graduate too long ago, they're generally PhDs. They have an extensive body of research kind of underneath them. They work for companies that are really distinguished themselves, and they're probably kind of working in some really important capacity for them. They are being paid a salary that's probably higher than the typical person in that field. Like those are that's kind of one, characteristic of somebody if they've just graduated recently. But I would say, for the most part, like O visa holders have worked, for at least 5 or 6 years in their field and built up their body of work, so that they've really, made a difference in their industry, and for their employer or employers. Possibly they've won awards in their field, those kinds of things. And so there really isn't one right answer, but you do have to kind of show like significant acclaim for the work that you've done.
I see. So we have 4 minutes left. I'm going to pick maybe 2 or 3 more questions in the interest of time. The next one is it possible to start a company with all H-1B founders or as a solo H-1B founder?
So I think the first option is probably better. You can certainly all have H-1Bs. Let's say there's 3 of you and you're all on H-1B. Because remember, the only requirement is that, that might be harder because then, so what I've done is, and this is not guaranteed, but each time you apply for an H-1B, you can say the other 2, let's say you have 3 founders, the other 2 can outvote you, and therefore they have the employer to employee relationship, right? But then you got to do that for each person, and that can get hard. They don't necessarily always catch on, but at some point they could, and that could be, potentially devastating. So it is better to have kind of a non-H-1B founder in the mix if you can. Or the way around that would be to gather a board of directors who have kind of veto power over decisions you make, which is maybe not great for you legally, but if you're able to pull that off, then you can show that as a way of being the employee to the company's employer, because they can overturn your decisions.
I see. Okay, the next question is the policy to eliminate country of origin clause for green card queue already in place?
No, it's a bill that has currently being so there's a House bill and a Senate bill, and they both want to do the same thing, but they have different provisions in them. So they're currently being reconciled right now. So it's not a law or it's not a policy yet. It's also part of the of Biden's bill, and so there would have to be further kind of like reconciliation with that if it were to kind of make any major progress. So hopefully something happens this year about that. We're as close to it as we've ever been, but it's not a reality yet.
I see. And so I'll make it the last question of the day. Do you or would you recommend law firms or lawyers who specialize in immigrant law for the G visa, which is the diplomatic visa?
Sure. I mean, if you contact me offline, I can send you some contacts for that.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. I think we'll just conclude today's event. Samir, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for your patience. Yeah, we all have a lot of questions about our immigrant status, and so thank you so much for your time to answer those. And since Samir's email's in the chat, so if you have any questions that you want to follow up, maybe your questions did get answered today, maybe Samir, like they will send you an email and follow up with you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, cool. All right. So that will be it for the event today. Folks, have a good rest of your night. Thank you so much for attending today's event.